small video clip. We are going to discuss preface to lyrical ballad. Preface to lyrical ballad is composed by William Wordsworth. Lyrical ballads is actually a collection of 23 poems. 19 poems are written by Wordsworth and 4 are by Coleridge. The edition of preface to lyrical ballad was first published in 1798 without preface. What do you mean by preface? Preface is nothing but an introduction to the book or to a theory, what shall we say, foreword. So in 1798, the first edition was published without preface. In 1800, second edition was published with preface. Why Wordsworth composed preface? It is because when he published lyrical ballads, he received criticisms from the poets of his age. What were the criticisms? Actually, the poetry of pre-romantic age were artificial. The poets of those age used high diction. They applied figurative speech and they used metaphorical applications. They used metaphors, similes in their poetry. But Wordsworth's poems were very simple, so they criticized his poem. To reply their criticism, Wordsworth composes preface for his collection of poetry. And the third edition was published in 1802 with revised preface. Now we shall see the gist of the preface, not in a very detailed way. In a small video clip, you cannot see all the details. Now I will tell you in summary, in a very nutshell, I will try to explain what the preface to lyrical ballad is. Actually, the preface to lyrical ballads can be discussed in 4 different headings. One is theory of poetry, language of poetry, subject of poetry, and purpose of poetry. In theory of poetry, Wordsworth gives definition to his poetry. He says, poetry is a recollection of emotions. He says, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. This is the definition given by Wordsworth. Then he says that it's very important point, truth and final spirit of all knowledge. Poetry is something special. Everyone cannot compose poetry. It is because it has such an important message for the reader. So it is called, Wordsworth defines poetry as truth and final spirit of all knowledge. Then he says that he has used a very simple language in his poetry and he advises the poet to use very simple language. And he wants the poet to write the poem in a very natural way. Writing poetry is something natural. It should not be an artificial thinking for a long time, contemplating on some topics and all. No, it should come naturally. This is what he talks in the heading theory of poetry. Now we shall move to language of poetry. He wants and he says that there is no difference between the language of prose and poetry. And he also says that the poetry doesn't need meter. Right? We know what is meter, the length and the breadth of verse in a poem is called meter. He says that without meter, poem looks beautiful. So meter is not an essential part of poetry. And he also says that poetry, the language of poetry should be the language of rustic. Who is the rustic? Rustic is, the villagers is called rustic. So Wordsworth wants the language of poetry should be the language of the rustic. And the fourth heading, subject of poetry, he says that the subject, I mean the character in the poems should be the rustic, and the characters in the poem should be the layman, general public, right? It is because there are a few poetry written on the layman, written on the rustics, and he also enforces that the language of the rustic is natural. So, if the poet composes poetry on the language of the rustic, the poem automatically become the natural poem. And he says that the events of day-to-day life of the general public should be the subject of the poetry. No poetry should be written on the incidents of the higher class people who are living in the mansion. He wants the subject of the poetry should be an incident taken from day-to-day life of a common man. And the last one, the very important point which he discusses in his preface, and it is the purpose of writing poetry. The main purpose of writing poetry is to entertain, is to delight, is to enlighten, is to give pleasure to the readers, right? The poet should not write a poem for his personal purpose, for his own interest, to give pleasure to the reader. That's the main purpose that should be the main purpose of composing a poetry. So this is what we have discussed. What we have discussed in this small video clip, the four, points which are discussed in preface to the lyrical ballads. Thank you. We will meet again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, I will report for